Democrats have made their demands for passage of this Homeland Security spending bill. Again, body cams on, masks off, easily identifiable badge numbers on all ICE and Border Patrol officers, and holding these agents to the same standards we hold all members of law enforcement. So what's the holdup? Republicans have their demands for what? Passage of what Chuck Schumer calls Jim Crow 2.0, the SAVE Act. Again, this is how they're going to dirty up a spending bill. The SAVE Act is a separate bill, but Republicans, at least some, want to sneak the SAVE Act into a spending bill for Homeland Security and make it permanent. Why do they sneak the SAVE Act into a spending bill? Because they know the SAVE Act could never pass on its own merits. So you have to sneak it into a Homeland Security spending bill. You have to hold Homeland Security ransom in exchange for a vote in favor of the SAVE Act. Members of Congress can't vote for this horrible bill on its own. But if you sneak it into a spending bill for Homeland Security, members of Congress can justify voting for the SAVE Act. I had no choice. It was either that or, if I voted against it, funding for Homeland Security wouldn't pass, so my hands were tied. That's why they dirty up bills. So what is the SAVE Act? It would demand that nobody in the United States can vote without some sort of photo ID. And it's all under the guise of tackling a non-existent problem made up by Republicans in the service of many things, but right now, the Great Replacement Theory. What is the Great Replacement Theory? Democrats, specifically the Jews, are opening up the border so millions of undocumented, dark-skinned immigrants can pour in and vote for Democrats, and in so doing, replace white people. If you think I'm kidding, I'm not. It's something that you don't want to give any oxygen to because it's just so out there and stupid and repugnant. But if you get one or two drinks into a MAGA Republican, after he's done making a pass at the other men in the room, that MAGA Republican will tell you that there is an actual plan to replace white people, to make them second-class citizens, and it's being masterminded by the Jews. This Great Replacement Theory is not limited to America. It comes out of Europe. The Great Replacement Theory comes from Europe and Russia. It's why Alternative for Germany scored second in last year's parliamentary elections. Elon Musk, big supporter of Alternative for Germany. J.D. Vance, big supporter of Alternative for Germany. Doesn't matter that there isn't a single shred of evidence to support any of this theory. It is and remains the foundational myth behind passage of the SAVE Act, which they claim, I think Chip Roy introduced this, it isn't about voter integrity. It's not about clean elections. It's about cleaning our nation's blood and soil by suppressing the vote of people of color. By requiring photo ID, you make it harder for reliably Democratic voters to cast their ballots. Reliably Democratic voters, of course, are people of color. If you're old, if you're poor, if you're sleeping on somebody's couch, if you don't own or rent, it's almost impossible to prove your place of residence with or without a photo ID. That means you can't vote. If the SAVE Act passes, you can't vote. In Trump's world, people who couch surf, people who are homeless, live in their car, people who don't have a car or a driver's license or a passport, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. They believe that. They don't believe everybody should vote. This isn't about making certain only citizens vote. This is about making it harder for certain citizens to vote. Black people, Latinos, poor people. And it goes back to Karl Rove and George W. Bush at the beginning of this century. They were the ones who started all this by perpetuating the lie of voter fraud. Non-existent voter fraud. They forced the Department of Justice to prosecute non-existent voter fraud in order to convince enough people we need to pass laws that will suppress the Democratic vote. If the SAVE Act ever became law, ordinary citizens would have to produce a birth certificate. Do you know where your birth certificate is? Do you even know how to get your birth certificate? You'd have to produce a passport. Do you have a passport? Poor people don't have passports. Or you're going to have to produce a real ID compliant document in order to register to vote. If you look at Florida, you know how hard DeSantis has made it for people of color or poor people to get the proper documentation to vote. The SAVE Act would outlaw registering to vote by mail or online. You'd have to go in person to register to vote. Chuck Schumer calls the SAVE Act more than just an abomination. He calls it Jim Crow 2.0. Why Jim Crow 2.0? Because when Reconstruction ended, we saw in the late 1870s and early 1880s the emergence of Jim Crow laws in the South, making it impossible for freed slaves to vote. During Reconstruction, this was in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the black vote, we're talking freed slaves, in the South, the black vote got as high as 90% in some parts of the South. By the early 1890s, thanks to Jim Crow and the ensuing voter suppression, the black vote in the South plummeted to 6%. So, how do you pass laws to keep freed slaves from voting? Poll taxes. You charge $1 or $2 to vote. That was a week's salary for a sharecropper, a job traditionally held by freed slaves who wanted to vote. You implement arbitrary literacy tests, randomly asking black voters, and only black voters, obscure questions about our Constitution, questions nobody could answer, even the people asking the questions. And those questions were only asked at the discretion of white election supervisors. You pass laws that grandfather in the right to vote. If your grandparents had the right to vote, i.e. they weren't slaves, then you don't have to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test. And it's legal, or at least it was legal, for more than 100 years until the Supreme Court began to step in, and then we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil War ended in 1865. We freed the slaves. It took 100 years for Congress to vote to pass the Voting Rights Act. So state by state, state by southern state, by the early 1880s, the white politicians, mostly Democrat, different party back then, they figured out a way to cut the black vote all the way down to 6%. It was 90% during Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws passed. Black vote in the South was down to 6%. And if black people don't vote or can't vote, our government doesn't have to pay any attention to them. The story of the modern civil rights movement, going back to the 1950s, has been about guaranteeing black people the right to vote. Yes, it was about being served at the counter at Woolworths, not being forced to give up your seat on the bus to a white person. It was about equal opportunity, an end to housing and jobs discrimination, and making sure predominantly black schools have the same resources as anybody else's. But I think at the core, and leave a comment if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right, I believe at the core of the civil rights movement was guaranteeing black people the right to vote. Because Dr. King and a lot of others who he worked with knew that voting is the embodiment of nonviolent resistance. Voting is ultimately how you make your voice heard. It doesn't matter how many people take to the streets. It doesn't matter how many of us turn out on No King's Day. All that matters is how many of us vote on Election Day. Protests are incredibly important, but they don't accomplish anything unless those protests translate into votes.